Welcome to the Sangamon Experience Community Trailblazers, and this month we're highlighting the iconic Sangamon County women here in Illinois. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the curator and director of experience at the Sangamon Experience at the University of Illinois at Springfield. It's been my pleasure to talk about these amazing women that have trailblazed across central Illinois, and today I'm continuing the work of telling the story of these iconic women. And today I get to speak with you about Sangamon County women and medicine. Now, we in the past have had a curator from the SIU School of Medicine here to talk about medical history and cholera here in central Illinois. And it got me thinking about some of the iconic women who practiced medicine, even when most women were not allowed to obtain a license to practice medicine here in central Illinois and across the United States. So as I was digging, of course, I turned to Sangamon Link to try to figure out if any articles have been printed or recorded about women practicing medicine here in central Illinois. And I found a few of them. I found a female dentist who started her practice here in Springfield and eventually became known as the first female dentist in the United States. In addition to that, I was able to find Miss Betty, who was a practicing physician here in the central Illinois area. And of course, the first ever maternal health institution here in central Illinois, not for the nation, but for central Illinois itself. In addition to that, you can see the remnants of some of the buildings that these women practiced in, but also there is evidence of the institutions that are still around today. And the organizations have been able to flourish over time. Some of them still remain in their original buildings. Some have had to rebuild, and some have just some interesting stories because of some of the adventures that these women went on. So I'm going to talk first about the first female dentist here in the Springfield, Illinois area. Now, the first female dentist was Miss Jeannie F Spurrier. She lived from 1847 till 1912. She's actually a very fascinating woman. I was not able to locate an image of her, but to get us started, I want to highlight the scope of Sangamon County at the time she was living. You may recognize this image from before. As I've spoken in the past, I've liked to showcase the map of Sangamon County because this shows the scope of what women were able to cover during that time, and also to give you kind of a sense of place of where we are, the area we're talking about, and kind of just the scope. So it's a nice reminder. Now, Jeannie F Spurrier, there's an advertisement for her in the Register, and this was before the State Journal Register became the uniting of two newspapers here in central Illinois, the Register and the Journal. Miss Jeannie actually advertised in both newspapers, but this was an image that was brought to light within the Sangamon Link article. Now, she was a dentist in Springfield in the beginning of 1877, and it is claimed that she was the first woman dentist and one of the earliest female dentists within the United States. So pretty cool having one of the firsts in the United States here in central Illinois. From what researchers have been able to find about her is that she was very independent, she was outspoken, and she was fearless. Now, in researching Miss Jeannie, some of her newspaper articles are very fascinating. I highly recommend that you find your local research database, so newspaper.com, which I know that the public library here in Springfield has, and take a look at some of her articles. They're pretty interesting. It shows how outspoken she was, how she was very blunt and straight to the point, and she didn't care what anyone else thinks. She was going to do what she wanted to do. Now, her first office was actually on the south side of the courthouse square, so Old State Capitol Plaza today. And in the register in 1890, this is what she wrote, or at least what was written about her. Quote, she met with a storm of opposition from the profession, who looked upon the advent of a lady dentist as threatening ruin to the whole fraternity. She was attacked through the press and every endeavor made to break her down, but she pursued the even tenor of her way. And today her practice surpasses that of any dentist in the city. It shows that Jeanine has a fighting spirit, and she was not going to let a group of individuals deter her from actually achieving her profession as a dentist. Now, there is some reports that there was a lady dentist before her in United States history, Miss Emmeline Robert Jones, who practiced dentistry in Connecticut and Rhode Island. But she didn't really have her own practice. She worked with her husband. Jeanine was the first independent female dentist in Central Illinois. So we can actually make that claim to fame. Now, there's another article that was written about her that showcases a little bit of where she got her educational training into becoming a dentist. Supposedly, she studied under Dr. C.G. French for 4 years before starting out in her own practice. Now, later on, she would have a story written and more advertisements that were written about her in regards to her practice. In the register, it ended up stating, quote, we can say truthfully of Our Lady Dentist that in her line she excels. Her patrons are numbered among our best people, while her large and increasing patronage is evidence that she has given satisfaction. So most of what we learned about Mrs. Jeannie Spurrier was the fact she was independent, outspoken, and fearless. We can get that from her advertisements. We get that from remembrances of her that have been written down. But mostly it's from the articles that she ended up writing. There's very little known about her early life. While studying her and looking at the ancestral records and family trees, it shows that she was born in around the mid-1840s in Valparaiso, Indiana. I hope I'm saying that right. And some sources state that she was born in around 1847. Others say 1845. So we can easily say the 1840s. But as she grew up and her family ended up moving into Illinois, she later on would not start off as a dentist. She ended up living in Jacksonville before she moved to Springfield. And it seems like she was a force of nature, according to the Sangamon Link article. She constantly told the newspapers about her activities, what she was doing. And before she started her dental practice, she was a seamstress, specializing in hoop skirts and bustles. In 1885, she patented an improved mosquito net, one that attached to bedposts with clamps, like a hammock. So it's interesting to see kind of what she did before she became a dentist. She was a part of the Universal Church. She regularly held sociables or social events in her dentist office. Doesn't seem very sanitary, but she ends up having socials within her dentist office. She was also a well-known Republican during her time living in Springfield. She had window decorations that she created to highlight the GOP. There was a big rally in support of presidential candidate James G. Blaine in 1884 at her dentist office. So she did a lot of campaigning for the candidates that she supported. So she wasn't just a dentist. She also was a seamstress and very active politically. Now, she later on would travel to Europe, and she would fill out a large amount of information within her passport. And of course, this is before photographs were used within passports. But she kept a record of where she went, what she did. In addition to that, she mentions in some of her writings and letting the newspaper know where she was going. She attended a dentist convention in Paris, and she had a companion that went with her, who was a woman from Cantrell. They visited Rome and climbed Mount Vesuvius when they went over to attend this dentist conference. When we study more about some of the things she had to overcome throughout her professional career, she constantly had to overcome this group of male dentists that thought that it was inappropriate for a woman to practice dentistry. She took advantage of a lot of innovations. She proved herself to be very capable of learning new ways to care for her patients. She ended up writing an article to advertise her dentistry and how she was being very innovative within the newspaper on May 10th, 1883. She advertised, quote, "From now until the first day of June, I will extract all teeth free of charge, using von Bonhurst's local anesthetic. Also electricity to render the operation painless. Having secured the assistance of a first-class operator, I am prepared to do all the work in dentistry to the satisfaction of everybody." That so far is one of my favorite advertisements of hers. Basically shoving it in the public's face and in front of the dentist in the area, stating, "I'm not afraid to learn the new and latest innovations in dentistry, and I will perform all of these tasks after learning them, and I will provide free tooth removal to my customers if they try out this new innovation." So it shows that she was willing to make strides. But her professional career started going downhill, not because she was not very good at her job. It was because she was caught up in a scandal in Springfield. She received the most public attention when she initiated the conviction of a supposed clairvoyant who was fleecing area residents in 1897 here in Springfield. She convinced the man who went by the alias of Luke Leslie was a fraud, and Spurrier pretended to believe in his visions to trap him in his scheme. She gave Leslie $60 worth of gold coins, which he would return later. When Leslie absconded with Spurrier's money and that of other victims, she sought his arrest. She then testified during Leslie's trial a few months later. If you want to learn more about this fortune teller scandal, I encourage you to go to Sangamon Link and take a look at this story. It's pretty interesting, especially if you're interested in the clairvoyance within Springfield. But I didn't think learning about a lady dentist that I would be running into clairvoyance in the midst of it. So it was an interesting rabbit hole to go down. But Miss Spurrier was not living in Springfield her whole life. She was a lady of travel. She eventually moved out to California, and she lived during the California earthquake that took place in on the West Coast. She goes on to write about her experience during the Great Earthquake to the Register, and she tells the Register that she wants to discontinue her membership to and subscription to the newspaper, considering she now no longer has a home to live in because the earthquake destroyed it. Eventually, Spurrier moved out to Missouri, and she ended up passing away March 4th of 1912. So she lives on as the legacy of the first female dentist, at least here in central Illinois. But her spunky personality, her drive for travel and new innovations has left her in the history books as a very interesting and groundbreaking lady here in central Illinois in regards to dentistry and invention. Now, as I went on to study more about women in medicine in Sangamon County, I came across Hettie Bunker Smith. Now, I wanted to make sure I had her whole name completely right because she was a very interesting woman who helped so many people out. And in reading her story, it shows her kind heart, it shows her passion for helping others, but also fulfilling a need for a population of people who were in desperate need of uplifting and more self-esteem. Hettie Bunker Smith was an art teacher and housewife. She is known for making artificial facial features for disfigured people in 1934. She made her first facial feature for a friend who asked her for help in covering a facial scar on her face. Now, she lived on Old Rochester Road, and she spent most of her time just being a housewife. But when people needed something made, a facial feature made, or some help covering up of an ailment of theirs that they've recovered from, she took the time to use her artistic ability to create facial features and other prosthetics for individuals in need. Now, she eventually received a presidential citation for her volunteer work in creating prosthetics for more than 200 World War II veterans. She traveled several times a week to Camp Atterbury, Indiana, to meet wounded soldiers and to make sure that they had the prosthetics that they needed. After the war, she gave demonstrations of her homegrown techniques to Mayo Clinic Hospital and other hospitals and medical facilities throughout the country. And what was interesting is Hettie did not order certain materials to create these prosthetics. She came up with them on her own by experimenting with different colors. She would use cocoa, she would use beeswax, paraffin, which added to the plastic to add the type of color that was needed to fit the skin tone of the person who would be wearing this feature or this prosthetic. It was very important to her to make sure that the skin tones were correct. She wanted the individuals to feel like they were completed when using these features that she would create. And so she went out of her way to not just make prosthetics for individuals in one color. She would make them in different shades that would allow the user to switch them out for the different seasons. And she would be in the process of making these prosthetics, and she would try out different colors to make sure that they were the shade that the individual needed. Now, in reading through all of her research, which you can find connections to her research in our local archives here in Springfield. Now, when she would create these prosthetics or these molds, the most common molds she would make were plastic ears, noses, every once in a while a few fingers. These would be different colors and different shades for the individuals that needed them. In an article that was written in 1947, the Illinois State Register described her approach with a few photos added to the article that were quoted. At times, only by her own imagination, she fashions molds made of equal parts of beeswax and paraffin over which the plastic is shaped. When completed, the parts are attached by a mastic gum and alcohol. Patients may remove them by applications of alcohol by putting them on and taking them off at will. The toughest challenges, she stated, was matching the patient's skin color. An ear, for instance, can have 5 to 7 shades, tints that change with a person's age and seasons of the year, she said. Smith blended cocoa and vegetable dye cake coloring to achieve the right skin tones, a problem that has stumped many technical experts who never thought of turning to such common materials. She would break the barriers of color molding. Now, she wasn't just a molder of prosthetics or facial features. She also had other occupations. She was the principal of Springfield's Sunshine School. Say that 5 times fast. And this was a school for children with respiratory diseases. It was during its she was the principal of the school for its entire existence from about 1926 to 1941. It was very evident that when she joined the school, a lot of the children were malnourished and malnourished. So she and her mother started an early version of the school breakfast, making sure that children were fed. And she and her mother brought large pots of oatmeal and in a cab that she would take to the school and serve it to the children every morning. It's very encouraging to see women like her go the extra step to care not just for those who were in need of limbs, but also in the children who were in need of food and comfort. Now, she served as a president of organizations representing both Springfield teachers and retired teachers. She was a part of Zonta Club and was named Springfield's Outstanding Career Woman of 1957. Now, eventually, she would be recognized by her alma mater, the Illinois State University, and she left money in her will to fund the Hettie Bunker Smith Presidential Scholarship. That was left to the school at the time of her death in 1989. Now, Smith grew up in Chatham, Illinois, which is just right outside of Springfield, still a part of Sangamon County, and she is buried in the Chatham Community Cemetery. She is a very interesting woman, and she had a very kind heart. And it's no surprise to me that the article within the Sangamon link was highlighted quite a bit. And one of the individuals mentioned within the unsung heroines, a salute to Springfield women, that was written by the Sangamon County Historical Society. And you can find it at the local library And here is what it looks like. I encourage you to pick up the book. There's a lot of women in here that I have not been able to cover in this series that are very important to Sangamon County history. Now, the next group that I would like to talk about are the early leaders of the Maternal Health Center. Now, I don't have an image of the center. I could not find one. I got started on this by looking at Sangamon Link and some of the articles that they have written about iconic women in medicine. And that's when I came across the Maternal Health Center. I wanted to include it not because these women were doctors or a part of the medical profession by practicing medicine, but I felt like it was iconic because this is women's health. Women's health is still under research. It's still a semi-new avenue for medical professionals. There is a lot to gain in studying women's medicine, considering women went for so long without proper medical care that's based on women's health specifically. A lot of times, women did not receive the proper care that they needed earlier on. Now, the Maternal Health Center was Springfield's first birth control clinic in central Illinois. It was created in 1938 by about a dozen socially prominent women within Sangamon County. The early leaders, as I have listed here, were Elizabeth Libby Lanphier, Callista Herndon, who is featured here. She was the only image I was able to find of these three women. Mary Dougie Funk. I like her name. It has a little bit of a spunk to it. But these three women show up quite a bit because they played an active role in the board on starting the Maternal Health Center within the Springfield area. Now, these women had to overcome a number of obstacles because, as we know from the history of birth control in the United States and in other countries, a lot of it was frowned upon. And the center faced a number of obstacles when it was created. First was there was an ignorance on the part of potential clients. The funding was not really there, and the local dominance of St. John's Hospital, which is still in existence today. Since it started off as a Catholic institution, it opposed a lot of unnatural forms of birth control. And it was hard to gather doctors to be a part of the Maternal Health Center because a lot of these doctors had to work at St. John's Hospital, which was the biggest medical institution in the area. Now, local doctors needed to work there, and some of them ended up working as well at the Springfield Hospital, which eventually would become the Memorial Medical Center. And this created a barrier for the center basically getting on its feet. There are a series of interviews that were done with Callista Herndon, and she goes on to discuss quite a bit about the founding of the Maternal Health Center. And you can find her oral history within the Sangamon State University archives here at the University of Illinois at Springfield. And it provides some very interesting insight into how, not just how the center was founded, but the difficulties they ran into, but also some of the successes they had. Herndon ended up saying within the interview, it all got into politics, really. I mean, their apprehension was about the political repercussions that might follow. Also, the religion. I mean, St. John's Hospital was the hospital, and they were told that they could not practice there if they gave assistance to us or to the people that Mrs. Zimmerman reported needed it. Now, Mrs. Zimmerman, the woman that is mentioned here, was involved with the Family Welfare Association, which is the precursor to the Family Service Center. And she was the one who figured out who needed care from the Maternal Health Center. And she recommended certain individuals to go to the center. Now, in looking into how they were able to get the word out, they talked about the great need. So when they went to advertise or went to ask for funding or to spread the word about the health center, they talked about the great need for information among poor women and to provide better health education for women in the area. The head of the local Visiting Nurse Association did not help in this. They were part of, the head was a part of the St. John's Hospital and the Catholic movement within the Central Illinois area. And this posed an issue for them. Now, other ministers, not just Catholics, got involved in stopping this group to start forming at the earlier onsets. And so it was hard to come up with funding, but nonetheless, they were able to rent 2 rooms over a drugstore in the 100 block of North 5th Street. Now, if you're looking in Springfield and you're wanting to find a location, the location was near the downtown Old Capitol Complex, and it's the area by the Alamo, which is a bar that's downtown, and right across the street from the PNC Bank that's built there, where the Orpheum used to be. So this is where the center ended up renting the 2 rooms. Now, the Illinois State Journal published a brief story on the clinic's opening in November of 1938. They ended up hiring a physician, a woman associated with the Illinois Birth Control League, who commuted from Chicago twice a month and started the clinic, which opened from 10 a.m. to 2 every Monday. Now, in the Illinois State Journal, when they published the story, they mentioned this. But the founders of the center relied specifically to get women to come to the center by first word of mouth, by telling people that the center actually existed. Mrs. Zimmerman and other ministers told women they encountered about the existence of the clinic. They informed women at PTA meetings, public aid meetings, and center volunteers staffed a booth at the Illinois State Fair to gain interest in the center itself. But the group's most effective tactic was to mail a notice to every new mother who had a birth notice published in the local newspapers. They were pretty much amateurs at this. Hernan goes on to talk about the struggle to actually get the center off the ground. But the response from all of their groundwork was very successful, and they were able to gather a large number of women and help them. Now, most women who came to the clinic were in their late 20s or 30s. Each was interviewed by a volunteer, and an appointment was made for a physical examination. The clients had to be married. This was one of their number 1 rules that they had. There had to be a husband. There had to be a man in their life. And they did go on to mention that they didn't follow up with this. So even though it was a requirement, they didn't really look too much into it. Again, they were running on just volunteers. And they wanted to make sure that it was written down for the record. Now, the biggest struggle that they had was getting women to return for the examination. So they would have an initial follow-up with them after their first appointment, and it was difficult to get them back. So what they ended up doing was they ended up picking them up and bringing them in after they have set a date for them to come back. If they didn't do this, they wouldn't show up. And once they were done, they would come in for an interview afterwards, and that would be it. Except for the physician, virtually everyone involved with the clinic was a volunteer. All of the volunteers were the ones who cleaned. They ended up being at the reception desk. They made and scheduled appointments for women. They also washed millions and millions of gloves. They made sure that they were sanitized. They were made sure that each pair of gloves the physician put on were clean. And this was all run on volunteers. Now, clients were only charged what they could afford. So there wasn't really a specific fee that was assigned for appointments. Whatever the woman was able to give, that was their payment. Now, volunteers ended up giving donations to make sure that women were still able to receive care for the first 2 years, and financials for the center were very shaky. So what ended up happening was there were a few backers for the center that were able to speak with a famous actress. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Who was also a singer. Her name was Jeanette McDonald. She starred in films such as The Naughty Moretta and The Merry Widow. And she came to perform in 1940 for a benefit concert for the center itself. But there were a lot of obstacles that ran in the midst of it. There were people who objected to birth control and began to campaign to talk McDonald out of performing in Springfield. Funk and Herndon described the controversy in a 1975 interview. Funk goes on to say, "We had a friend who was a friend of the banker for Jeanette McDonald. And that was when she was at the height of her popularity. She willingly signed a contract to come to appear for our Maternal Health Center. We started promoting it and talking about it. The Catholics were very upset and wrote her threatening letters, and they would do everything to hinder her from coming. So she tried to break the contract. And we had a member, Louis Gillespie, who wrote to her. He was the lawyer. And so McDonald put the date for Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, hoping that would discourage us and we would break the contract. But we went on in the old Orpheum Theater, which was quite large, and it was packed. But she was so apprehensive about coming that her husband came with her, and she made it sound as if the benefit was a maternity thing. She sang a lullaby, and so without having to do with contraceptives in any way. I was pregnant at the time, and I was pregnant. It was one of the most exhilarating, frustrating events. The Orpheum was filled. We were elated. We were so excited. Here she was, and we had sold many tickets, and so we were financially secure up until the time the center was closed. That was the one thing they did. That was the one event that secured them for staying open. The big boost in clientele went up after World War II when the husbands were all coming home. And some Catholic doctors were referring women to the clinic for information they could not provide. But patronage fell off in the 1950s. And after that, they renamed themselves Planned Parenthood Association of Springfield and had a regular local position. Now, there have been many doctors that have come in and out of the Maternal Health Center, now Planned Parenthood, and they have congratulated women on births of their babies, but have also been there to help educate women about their health. Now, with more information available on birth control, at least by the 1960s, local volunteers closed up shop in about 1964. And in 1971, the remaining board members sent the $700 left in the group's bank account to the National Planned Parenthood organization. Now, the story of these women making sure that women received proper medical care and attention shows their passion for caring for the health and well-being of women here in Central Illinois, which is why they are highlighted today. Their legacy is the legacy of all women who have benefited from their help and assistance over the years. Now, I tell their story because women's medical health is still under scrutiny today. We are still learning from women's health. We are still learning more about how to best care for women and how to best educate the public about sex education. And these women made it their role to continue telling the story of how we can benefit others through medical health. The last group I'm going to mention is the Hospital Sisters of St. Francis. Now, if you've noticed in driving around Springfield, if you take the Clinton exit out of Springfield, Illinois, it will lead you to the Hospital Sisters of St. Francis and their facility. Now, I bring them up because a lot of the women who passed through the Hospital Sisters was able to help in a number of ways generate a sense of care for their communities. They have served the sick in Central Illinois since 1875. Their headquarters that I was talking about is a 300-acre site northeast of Springfield. They're order of Roman Catholic nuns, and they also led to the construction of the St. John's Tuberculosis Sanitarium and St. Francis Convent in 1917. The first structure opened July 18th of 1919, and the site, according to Sangamon Link, quote, needed fresh air and sunshine, the recommended treatment for tuberculosis patients at the time, unquote. That was quoted on the Sangamon Link site, and that was taken from the Hospital Sisters website, which is still up and running. The sanitarium eventually closed in 1973, but that did not end the work of the sisters. As of 2013, the site housed the convent of the Mother House of the American Province of the Hospital Sisters of St. Francis. There's also administrative centers there, and Crucifixion Hill Cemetery, and they have a mission outreach and the Char Center. Having visited the Char Center, it's a very peaceful place that tells a rich story of the sisters and their care for those in need, recovering from ailments here in Central Illinois. At the peak of the creation of the Hospital Sisters, they ended up having around 700 nuns living at the sisterhood home. Now, there are about 80 nuns living there today. Most of them are elderly. But one thing that I don't think is highlighted enough with the museums here in Central Illinois is the museum that is located within the Sisters Char Center. And that specific museum tells the rich history of the medical background of these sisters and the care they gave to not only tuberculosis patients, but patients who had smallpox, polio, and there's even a section within their museum that discusses their care for Mary Lincoln when she was sick here in Springfield. Now, as of the end of this month, the Char Center will be closed permanently, sadly. I hope that the Char Center will be able to pass along their knowledge and share that museum with the community later on. And I hope that it'll eventually open back up because it is truly a remarkable museum. Now, the Sisterhood of St. Francis focuses on medical help. And so there are a series of ministries that are created by the sisters at St. Francis that have contributed to the care and well-being. They're most well known with the work with Mary Lincoln, but also within the health of tuberculosis patients. But there is a nursing school connected to the St. Francis Sisters that is still around today, training young women to care for others that are sick and are in need. And their story is still being told. And it is very remarkable to see how they have been able to grow and expand their outreach here in the Central Illinois area and sending women out to care for others in the world. Now, today I went a bit long because there were a lot of women who are very iconic in the medical field here in the Central Illinois area that either practiced medicine, helped doctors practice their craft, but also women who supported medical advances for others here in the area and volunteered their time and energy to make sure the sick were well cared for. And their stories are still continuing today. And I wanted to also thank all of the doctors and nurses that have been fighting to end this pandemic that we have been going through. They have worked tirelessly to care for not just patients who are suffering from everyday ailments, but also fighting the pandemic at the same time. And it is to all our healthcare workers here in Central Illinois and throughout the state that I dedicate this particular program to. Now, of course, at the end of every single program that I give to you for Community Trailblazers this month, I encourage you to look at the Sangamon Link stories that are put there. I've only scratched the surface of the amazing articles that are presented within the Sangamon Link archives. But I also encourage you to reach out to your local archives, such as the Presidential Library and Museum's rich historical collections, the Sangamon Valley Collection and their wealth of knowledge of photography, but also main events and papers that have a rich story to tell. Also, take a look at your own family's past. Some of them may have come in contact with some of these iconic women, but also they may have been iconic women themselves. But we never know until we ask the key questions, until we end up interviewing our ancestors and family members, either through sitting down and speaking with them or visiting the historic records they left behind. And I mean their diaries, journals, letters, photographs, and their records that you can find on genealogical websites as well. So if you have an iconic story about any of the women in your life, feel free to send that to Sangamon Experience at uis.edu. We'd love to hear your stories about the iconic trailblazers in your life. Tune in next time when we tell more amazing trailblazer stories about women here in Sangamon County. Next week, we will be focusing on activists, women who have broken barriers here in Sangamon County to make sure that everyone has the rights and freedoms that we all enjoy today. In addition to that, I will have some very interesting articles that have popped up regarding Illinois women, specifically here in Central Illinois. So I encourage you to come back for our final Community Trailblazers episode on women next week at noon, like we have had every Wednesday this month. Thank you so much for joining me on Community Trailblazers, the women of Sangamon County, and I hope to see you next week when we talk about women and activism.